It is September 25th, 2017. I'm Ashton Ellett. We're here in Atlanta, Georgia with Jim Galloway, participating in the two-party Georgia Oral History Program, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Thank you for joining us today, Jim.
No, happy to be here.
Really do appreciate it. So just to get started, tell us a little bit about your upbringing, your childhood, where you're from.
I was born in Medina, Ohio, a little town right outside of Cleveland. It was a farming community then. I was moved south on November 22nd, 1963. So the president was shot, school ended, and I was bustled into a station wagon, and we moved to Atlanta and arrived there maybe the next day or the day after.
It's a heck of a day.
Yeah. It's right in the middle of desegregation.
In what year? How old were you?
I was 8 years old.
You were 8. So you were cognizant of the the events
and I think everybody was around me. Maybe not my parents. You got to remember also, this was 2 months after the Birmingham bombing, where the little girls were killed.
Right.
So I think my third grade teacher understood what I was getting into. My going away present was a copy of Tom Sawyer.
Well, as a Midwesterner, and somebody who went to school in Illinois and Missouri, Tom Sawyer is still taught. Mixed feelings among the children who have to read it. So, what was it like moving down to Atlanta?
Well, let me see. You stood out a little bit. You stood out and apart from people. And I can remember my first visit to the boys' room in Meadows Elementary School, where the panel was assembled, and they demanded to know whether I was a nigger lover or not.
And how did you handle that?
I didn't handle it well. I don't think. I can't remember how I handled it, but I don't think I don't think I was of stellar moral quality there. But I've since figured out that Kennedy's assassination was kind of the last chance for Southern segregationists to change the course of history, and they were just there were all these hopes and prayers among white Southerners that Lyndon Johnson would who was a fellow Southerner, wouldn't go the same way. And of course, the first thing he did was he said, "We're going to pass the Civil Rights Act," and sort of kind of destroyed that. The school was at that time was all white, and it was right off Old National Highway in South Fulton, maybe a 15-minute drive to my father's shop at the airport. He was a foreman of the maintenance crew for United Airlines.
Okay. So we've talked about your memory of the Kennedy assassination. What was your first memories of Georgia politics, or Georgia politicians, I suppose?
Georgia politicians. It was probably the 1966 governor's race.
A historically significant one.
Exactly right, and. Of course, I think I'm right. Bo Galloway won the plurality, did he?
Correct.
Not? Right.
Correct.
And so I can remember sitting in the living room and saying, "Well, certainly the General Assembly is going to choose him as the next governor." And my dad said, "No, that's not how it works."
And it is not how it worked.
Right.
So yeah, so that's your entry point into Georgia politics. You took your AB then at University of Georgia.
Right. I graduated in 1977.
Were you involved in politics on campus or reporting on it?
Covering them. I was. Worked for the Red and Black. Started out as a photographer because I couldn't type.
No. Neither can I.
I was writing news stories in longhand, and that just wouldn't do. So I was a photographer there the first year, and then I was editor of the paper by the very end.
So you leave University of Georgia and then come to the Atlanta Journal or Atlanta
Well,
Constitution?
I had interned at the Atlanta Constitution
Okay.
in '76. That summer, and that was I think the extent of my political duties is when Jimmy Carter was accepting the nomination for the Democratic nomination for president. My job was to call. We had phone books then, so you just picked out names out of the phone book.
Very scientific.
I rang them up and asked whether they were watching Jimmy or they were watching the John Wayne movie playing opposite him. Quite a few were watching the John Wayne movie.
Yeah, understandable.
So so after that, after I graduated, kind of the rule was that you went elsewhere to make your mistakes. And I went to the Anderson Independent.
Anderson, South Carolina.
In South Carolina, right across the border. Covered a little politics, but not much.
Okay. So you didn't have political reporting necessarily in your bones or
No, I didn't come at it that way.
You didn't?
I did not, no. No, I mean, in Anderson, I had my one big story was there was a televangelist. They were just coming up then.
Mm-hmm. You're right.
And this guy's name was Leroy Jenkins.
Good name.
And he fancied himself kind of a cross between Jesus Christ and Elvis. Started buying up a lot of land in the town of Greenwood, South Carolina, and decided he was going to be mayor there. We spent a lot of time digging and found a lot of nasty stuff on him. He had just moved down here after from Ohio after his cathedral had blown up, dynamited.
Oh.
Right after he took out a $1 million insurance policy.
Nothing suspicious about that?
No. And eventually he hired a hitman to go after my partner, and if I was there with him, then me too. But the hitman turned out to be an ATF agent. So I think he did about 7 years. I think he died this year as we talk. He went back to evangelism, after he left prison. But
right. So you made your bones
I made
in
my
Anderson.
bones, and I made my bones in Anderson and in religion, and we're going to come
religion
back to that.
and politics.
Religion and politics. And then I got hired back to kind of it wasn't the AJC then, but it was starting to pull together.
So merging the newsrooms together.
And we had a suburban, we had the Journal, we had the Constitution, and then we had a joint editorial project in suburbia.
Right.
And because I was from the Atlanta suburbs, they had a place for me as an editor. So I ran the North Fulton Extra.
Okay.
The Extra is what we called it then. Started on September 6, 1979.
Yeah,
it was a weekly, every Thursday.
Sort of peak suburbia.
Right. And then I moved to Cobb.
Okay.
Where I bought a house. And I did start paying attention to politics there.
In Cobb County
in Fulton and in Cobb.
Okay.
And they were just turning Republican at that point.
Right.
Tom Sharon in Cobb, the DA, had just won that race, and Bill Hudson was about to flip over. When the sheriff flips over in a county, that spells the end of it. And so after maybe 2 years doing editing. I mean, I was an editor for the Journal. I was running a bureau when I was 23 years old.
Is that's an unusual?
That's an unusual
path?
That's an unusual path, and I was finding it uncomfortable because I'm having to tell 40-year-olds what to do.
Right.
So I decided I want to go back into writing. Okay. The only opening that they had was with the Atlanta Journal as a religion writer.
Ah. So what section would that put you in? Religion, and was there a religion section or lifestyles?
You had Billy Speed on one side. She was the Gail White on the Constitution side, Billy Speed on the Journal side, and I'd work with Billy, but I came at it from a different direction. I mean, well, first of all, they did take me in as a religion writer because I actually went to church when I was a kid.
Okay.
You know, Dad was a deacon over at the Red Oak Christian Church off Roosevelt Highway.
Okay.
Deacon and elder, very active. We were very active in the church, you know, until I started working full time, and then I kind of dropped away.
Right.
But I spoke church, you know.
You knew the shibboleths.
I did. I
as
did.
it were.
And so I wasn't afraid of the topic.
Right.
But I started approaching it in a different manner because things were changing. You had Pat Robertson kind of coming up.
And we'll come back to him.
Right. Yeah.
Later.
We had. I mean, Ronald Reagan was wooing the Southern Baptists away from Jimmy Carter. You know, the first big story I did, I guess, as a religion writer would have been. Do you remember Guy Sharp?
The name is familiar.
He was a weatherman here. Well respected. I mean, just an older fellow that you build a franchise around. You know, I think he was Channel 11.
Okay. I was going to ask.
XIA, I think XIA, and he started, and he was a part-time preacher as well.
Okay.
And he started passing around this rumor that Procter & Gamble was a satanic corporation because of the Stars and Moons logo.
I remember my grandmother and great aunt vaguely talking about this in the late 80s. It was still late 80s, early 90s.
Procter & Gamble came after him. He was fired. He lost his job with a TV station. It essentially took retirement.
Sure.
So, but it was kind of that was the direction I was looking at religion as more of as a cultural phenomenon and how it worked and how it fit with the rest of the social structure.
So contextualizing
and the political structure, right.
I read somewhere that you said the nastiest political race you ever covered was actually for the Southern Baptist Convention.
Adrian Rogers versus Winfred Moore. Winfred Moore was and I'm hard put to say the year. It might have been 88 or 87, but it was. But Adrian Rogers was a super church pastor from Memphis.
Okay.
One of the first with Charles Stanley. Then Winfred Moore was a more traditional Southern Baptist from Fort Worth, right? And you know, you had these these campaigns that would occur every other year because it was a 2-year term for SBC president, and it's all by election, you know, by a convention of messengers who are sent to a specific place, not unlike a political convention. And if you and what I quickly figured out is that if you watch the progress of the Southern Baptist, the denomination itself, it was about 2 years ahead of the Republican Party.
Right. Around this, basically, I mean, if you put it in 1987, 1988 is Pat Roberts, and these are a lot of people who would be familiar with the process. Right,
and the whole movement was about expelling the moderates from influence.
Again, very familiar.
Exactly, and there was that parallel, and so when the world began to shift in Georgia. You know, it was. I eventually joined the political team. You know, but I was the low man on the totem pole.
Who were some of the other people that were? We were talking off camera. There's quite a stable of
let me
political
see.
writers.
A lot of them had left because Jimmy Carter. When Jimmy Carter became president, of course, a lot of our political staff went to work in the White House with him. So people like Claudia Townsend and such.
Right.
You know, they were 1 or 2 grades ahead of me. You had Albert May, who teaches over at George Washington? I think George Washington University now. You had Chuck Walston. You had Gene Cummings, who's with Wall Street Journal now.
Was
or
David
Bloomberg.
Norden still?
David Norden was still there, yes.
Yeah.
David Norden was there. I wish I'd studied up on this.
No.
I know I'm gonna leave. David Morrison
Right.
was another good
Right.
one. Let me see here. Of course, Bill Shipp was doing his thing.
Was he as a
he wa-
columnist at that time?
Well, he was. Bill came up as an editorialist.
Okay.
I mean, he was a city editor at some point. But
Also out of the Red and Black.
right, exactly. But most of his columnizing was on the editorial page.
Okay.
Okay, and that's one thing that separates me from him. Rick Allen, of course,
Oh, yeah. Yep. Frederick Allen.
was another one, and I don't think Tom Baxter, In and Out.
And Tom Teep, who just recently passed away, he was editorial.
He was the editor of the editorial page.
Okay.
Which at that point was a very prestigious position. Right.
Sure.
So anyway, I was the new, I was the youngster. I was the green guy. So it was very easy for editors to look at me and say, "Look, Democrats are running the place. You go cover the Republicans."
Oh, okay. So that puts you. So when did you make that transition from religion to political writing?
It was about the time when with Pat Robertson.
Okay,
I think
so
it's
the
fair
88.
to say. I think it's fair to say with Pat Robertson, where the two really blended together.
Right.
And they could see that I could write politics as well as religion. Then and so that was about it. And I spoke suburban too.
Right.
I spoke church and I spoke suburban.
So you are well placed, well versed to study the rise of the Georgia Republican Party.
Right.
In the 80s and 90s.
And when the shift really began to take off, I was the guy who had all the phone numbers.
So tell me about you as a political writer, sort of studying the growth of the Republican Party. You'd been here since the 60s. Republicans had struggled and floundered, had ups and mostly downs. What was different by the time you started covering them in the 1980s and 1990s?
Well, it was interesting. The first time I really started covering them, it might have been a few years before '88, actually, in the legislature.
Okay.
I know, when was the Challenger explosion? It was '83?
No, it was January '86.
Okay.
Does that sound right?
I know I was working the Capitol then because I
know it was cold. It was cold because of the O-rings.
I watched it on the monitors in the Capitol. Because we had this in the Capitol where the House Judiciary Chairman now sits, in that little room, and in the room in front they crammed about 20 reporters, print and TV, with all the equipment. So it was jam packed back then.
Full house.
But you saw this kind of new brand of Republican that's and it predates it predated the social conservative takeover.
Okay.
And it was of course it was led by Johnny Isakson and Paul Coverdell. Lee Radonis was one of the staffers. He might be a good one for you to interview.
He was, I believe, the media.
Yeah.
I don't know if he was necessarily communications. That's what he
Yeah,
was.
yeah. He was, and he
director.
was kind of the liaison and what became very clear is that on many positions, including race, the Republicans held the more moderate positions. Were more moderate than the Democrats, than many of the Democrats. Because you had a whole lot of the Black Urban Alliance that Carter had started. It wasn't fully implemented yet, and there was still room for Republicans to make some gains and alliances here and there.
Right.
So you had Isakson and both Isakson and Coverdell with reputations that were far more moderate than they would end up having when they became U.S. senators or members of Congress.
Okay. Do you chalk that up to their personal characteristics, or the fact that was it the rural urban, suburban divide?
I think once you had people realizing that the Republican Party if not in power, was about to go into power, then you saw lots of people getting into it, and that's when you saw the dynamic of a primary shift.
Okay.
You know,
Okay.
I mean, I could remember, and I've been trying to remember exactly where it was. I was walking into a state GOP convention with Johnny Isaacson, and I used the M word, and he said, "Don't call me that anymore. I'm a conservative."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know.
This would probably have been the '95 convention down in Savannah, if that was his.
It might. I think it was a little bit earlier than that, but it might have.
Okay.
Been. It might have been because it might have been even during his gubernatorial. When was his gubernatorial bid?
1990. Since you mentioned Johnny Isaacson, do you think that is the shift within the Republican Party once the Christian right was sort of, I don't want to say co-opted because that's not the right word, amalgamated within the Republican establishment? Was that the fuel that the Republican Party needed in Georgia in terms of human capital, energy?
I think in terms of consolidation.
Okay.
Yeah, I think in terms of consolidation, it was absolutely essential to putting him over. You remember, I mean, we had this little dance in the Senate race. You know, we had Mac Mattingly beat Talmadge, and then Weich Fowler beat Mattingly, and then Coverdell beating Fowler.
Right, 92.
So it was back and forth and back and forth, and I think that once you saw the Christian conservatives really move hard over to the Republican side, that told you where everything was going.
Now, did you cover that 90? Since you mentioned Coverdell, 92, there was a very, very hard-fought primary for that Republican nomination for Senate to face Weich Fowler, with Paul Coverdell, obviously, who was state senator at the time, but also Bob Barr, who was, I think at that time, a former U.S. attorney, and then also John Knox, the former mayor from down in Waycross. How did the moderates, so-called, fend off electorally the Christian right?
Okay, and this is where you're entering a couple years where I might be weak on this.
Okay.
Okay, that's just to let you know here. What happened was, again, I didn't start out to be a political reporter.
Right.
It's one of those things that happen. My object with staying with the AJC is was and still is a privately held, family-owned
Cox
Media Group, a newspaper, and it had a worldwide view. It had bureaus in Moscow, London, Jerusalem. It had just opened up one in Tokyo in 1988. I made a bid for that. I was asked to stand down because I was needed for the '88 convention, the Democratic convention in Atlanta.
Oh, right.
Okay.
Right.
So the next year they decided that they were probably going to open one in Beijing. So I got myself a fellowship up at Michigan, University of Michigan. Spent a year studying language, economics, and such, and went off and found myself on the square on June 4th, '89.
Tell us about that while we're on. I can remember as a 4-year-old.
Oh God, don't tell me that.
No, well, I mean, yeah. I was sitting in my great aunt Lorraine's living room, and I can vividly, and this is probably why I remember it. It was night, so they were showing the footage of the troops going in at night, and I can remember her clear as the day, turning to me and said, "They would do that to us if they could," and I was terrified. I didn't know what she meant. I didn't even know who they were until later on. I remembered that those images.
No, we had gone up there. I had gone up there to just to scout out the place. I had finished the fellowship at Michigan, and pretty much just hopped on a plane to Beijing, or to Shanghai, and I was going to kind of make a tour of the country. The protests erupted, and so I cut all that loose, and I just flew up to Beijing, and was there for 5-6 weeks. I spent every day pretty much on the square, and it started out as very interesting, and it reached a fever pitch, and after about 3 weeks, I think Dan Rather showed up, and so you knew people were watching at home, and then you saw the adults start to pull away, and you knew something was about to happen. So I ended up most of the shooting and the killing was west of the square. Was in the Mushidi district.
But you stayed through.
I stayed when the first APCs came through, and got burned by the mob, by the crowd. They were the first
With torches or
Molotov cocktails.
Okay.
You had APCs kind of barricades. The students had and workers had put up barricades, and the APCs were plowing them under. And they torched the guys, killed the guys inside. And you're just standing there watching that. And then ultimately, I grabbed my translator, just probably a third-year college student, and we hoof it back to the hotel. The wife had come. Judy had come. I want to say maybe 2 weeks in. She landed at the airport at 7 o'clock at night, and they declared martial law at 8. So it was. I was a hit with the in-laws.
I can only imagine. So when do you come back to Georgia?
I come back to Georgia, and I come back to the first great newspaper recession.
Okay. Did that coincide with the sort of the Bush economic downturn in the early 90s?
This would have been 88, the summer of 88. So,
okay.
so I think so. Yeah. We had a newspaper recession. They said no Beijing bureau. I had to find a place, and so I went back into editing.
Okay.
And by 90, I was running the political crowd. I had charge of the political crew.
Okay.
And so this is a long way of getting to your story. In '92, because I was heading up the team, I had to delegate the coverage of the Senate race.
Okay.
To somebody, and so I don't have a whole lot of memories of the '92 Senate race. I was busy with the presidential contest.
Sure.
However, though, now I did, I was hands-on with the 1990 race for governor too.
Okay, so that's a very fascinating race, maybe overlooked by many, because if you go back and look at just the raw numbers, it doesn't look like a close race. From our perspective now, but this was Zell Miller, who came out of a very crowded Democratic primary field, winning a runoff with Andrew Young, to face Johnny Isakson, who at that time was a relatively moderate suburban businessman, Chamber of Commerce Republican. Tell me about how that race was sort of framed.
Well, first of all, one story is that, now I'm getting mixed up in my dates here. I was covering City Hall.
Okay.
So it was it's probably before China. But Andy Young is wondering about what he's going to do next.
Right.
He's wrapping up his second term. And so I'm a cyclist. I was a cyclist at the time.
Okay.
I mean a long distance guy.
Oh wow.
Hundreds of miles. At a time, and I start talking to Andy about this ride called the Bicycle Ride Across Georgia. It's not a race. It's just 1,000 of your closest friends get on bicycles and they start riding across the state and camping, on football fields or parks along the way.
Do you ride from Rabun Gap to Tybee Light?
I've done that. Yeah, I've done that. And he says, I'm going to do that too. Okay. We had just won the Olympics, so that may be a time marker for you.
Okay. Yep.
Okay. And somebody had given him a very fancy high-end bike. All right?
Mm-hmm.
And he says, I'm going to do this race. Another time marker. Harold Washington had just died of a heart attack.
Okay.
In Chicago, the mayor of Chicago. And me, I see an opportunity. I call up my boss on the city desk and say, Andy Young just told me that he's going to do a statewide bicycle ride. And Harold Washington just died. And I think Andy's about the same age. We need to have somebody with him the whole way. and so the paper paid me to get on my bicycle, and I
something you would have done for free.
Something I would have paid to do.
Right.
And so I got a not so free ride. I still had to pedal, and of course Andy followed his bodyguard. Well, actually, Andy led the bodyguard for the first couple days. Because that's, the bodyguard wants to be a little bit behind so he can have the clear field of vision, except that then the hardcore cyclist told him that he was doing it wrong, and he ought to have George Turner, who was the police chief, who became the police chief, leading Young, and kind of letting Young ride in his draft, which made it easy. And Andy, every day at the end of it, we would ride from maybe 7 in the morning until noon or 1 o'clock, and then Andy would get in a city car and drive back to the city,
mm-hmm.
and do a little bit of work, listening to country music, there and back, trying to get and what he later told me, this was his way of kind of getting in touch with the Georgia voter. So and if you remember, if you're into cycling, number one, you're wearing a helmet.
Right.
You're wearing glasses, big old sunglasses, because it's in the heat of the day. You look just like everybody else. Andy Young was kind of light-skinned, and I think it was his opportunity to go almost incognito and introduce himself around.
Mm-hmm.
And he liked the reception that he got. He really did. He was and in that primary runoff in 1990, when he only cleared, when it was clear that the vote was purely race driven. It was that he wasn't getting those white voters that he needed. There wasn't that crossover. When he wasn't getting that bump, that connection that he felt was out there when he was out there bicycling.
Right.
That was the punch in the gut for him.
That he wasn't able to bring them, even though he felt he had connected.
Right.
Bring them over and
in the
convince
voting
them to
booth. It wasn't working. So Zell took that race.
Mm-hmm.
He took the Democratic nomination. He had spent 16 years as lieutenant governor.
Right.
And he was pretty hard put. Isaacson got the nomination on that side, and it began getting clear that he was having a problem with his position on abortion.
Something that would dog him in
Exactly,
later races.
Yeah. But he got the nomination nonetheless. And I do remember getting in Dutch with Zell when I was working with, when you're an editor, you're working with other reporters' copies, and if they're not making the point that needs to be made, you need to step in there and you fix their copy. You make it clear, you add the stuff that needs to be added. And I added a piece to a few sentences to a story by Deborah Scroggins. She was the writer there then. And that basically pointed out that for the first time, you had a Republican candidate who could actually appeal to African Americans in Georgia, in the same way that Democrats could, because Isaacson had a good reputation in the legislature for working with the Black Caucus
mm-hmm.
there, oh, Zell just went over the top. And I got double teamed by Paul Begala and James Carville.
How'd that go?
We took a table in the newspaper's cafeteria, the Deadline Diner, and for two hours I got chewed out. You know.
Was it good cop, bad cop, or was it bad cop, bad cop?
I think Begala was the good cop. Yeah. And you know, I think Zell came in at one point and started yelling at the assistant managing editor and managing editor, too. But it as it turned out, I think Isaacson solved the problem for me, because in a few days after that, he under some questioning, I think he expressed some doubt as to whether he would vote for renewal of the Voting Rights Act.
Right.
And that answered everybody's questions about his appeal to the African American voter.
Right. So we were talking about Johnny Isaacson going forward. There was a lot of speculation that in 1994, when after Governor Miller broke his one-term pledge, that Johnny Isaacson would mount take another go at the race, but he doesn't, and then enter Guy Milner into Georgia politics, who is the gubernatorial, Senate, and then gubernatorial candidate in
94 and 96.
94, 96, and 98 against Governor Barnes. What do you remember about Guy Milner and sort of his presence within the Republican Party?
I never interacted with him, quite frankly. No, I didn't, because I had how to phrase this. I had a falling out with my friends in management at the AJC, and pretty much got booted out of the building.
Oh.
Sent back to the burbs, if you will. And which is, in the end, turned out fine, because I started writing again.
Sure.
In a column style. So I missed the Guy Milner years pretty much. Okay. What I did then was I started paying attention to Johnny Isaacson, and I cannot remember what it was. It might have been after the 96. When did Isaacson try for?
96.
96. It was probably sometime after 96.
When he tried for Senate.
Right.
Yeah.
And the abortion stuff bit him in the butt. And he lost that. And it was just, it wasn't a terrifically well-written column, but it was I just said that, I wrote that it's a shame that a figure like Isaacson, who's just extremely competent, well liked, there was no place in Georgia politics for him. I just I couldn't fathom that. Okay. Next day I get a phone call, and of course it's Johnny, saying thank you, and I don't think I'd ever I hadn't spoken to him since Capitol days, but right after that, if you'll recall, Linda Schrenko has made has kind of broken the barrier, and is the first Republican school superintendent.
Right.
And she is a disaster. And she's just a loose cannon all the way around. And Zell reaches out to Johnny Isaacson and asks him to be chairman of the school board. And of course, Isaacson says yes. And so you have this comeback begin. Right. And that was the beginning of it. I think that column helped push him a little bit, to let him know that there was, that he still had some juice out there.
Right.
He'll bring it up. He'll bring it up every now and then, even now.
And of course, you used that position to springboard him into the special election in
Exactly.
99.
Yeah, exactly. And when
It is not. Yeah, it's 99, I believe.
no. But first of all, it was you had Newt. You
Right.
had Newt. You had Newt. See, and this is of course, Cobb is home to Newt too. So I get a nice dose of republicanism that way.
Oh, sure.
But
the 6th district.
Right, but when Newt resigns, of course, you have that special election in February, where finally it's nonpartisan.
That's right. As we all know from this past summer.
Right. So Johnny Isakson finally has that entry point where he doesn't have to deal with the hardcore Republican segment of the Republican Party, or he can compensate with it with other ways other ways. And I'm sure he got a lot of Democratic votes in Cobb.
If I recall correctly, his primary opposition. Not sure who the lead Democrat in that race was, but his Republican opposition came from Christina Jeffrey.
Right. Yes.
Who was like Newt's Speaker Gingrich's house historian or something like that.
Well, she taught at KSU. She was a professor, associate professor maybe, at Kennesaw State, and Gingrich elevated her to historian of Congress. And I don't think she ever served there. I think
I'm not sure.
I think the appointment became rather controversial. So yeah, she was a movement conservative.
Very much so. Very much so.
But Isakson finally got his seat.
And then finally wins a statewide election in 2004. After Zell retired.
Okay. Yeah. Right.
Right, and of course because Paul Coverdell passed away very suddenly. I think summer of 2000.
He passed away summer of 2000. I think in June. I'd have to go back and take a look at it.
It's June or July. I know it's summer.
I know, and because immediately after that we had the Republican National Convention. I think in Philadelphia.
It was.
Okay, and essentially, you had a convention within a convention. There, you had a Georgia convention meet every day on who was going to become the candidate to replace Paul Coverdell. And it became
very familiar. Mac Mattingly.
Mac Mattingly, that's who it was. Thank you very much.
Mac Mattingly sort of emerged.
That's what it was. Yes,
back on the scene.
He was back. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, Mac Mattingly came back. And Cleveland, was it? No, Cleveland, no, not. Who took it? Who took that race?
Zell.
Zell took that. No.
Who are we talking?
Oh, that's right. Zell was appointed. You're right. Zell was appointed.
Governor Barnes, very shrewdly appointed.
Barnes would tell you that that's the biggest mistake of his career.
Was taking the appointment?
Was appointing Zell. Or at least many of the people around Barnes would say that.
This isn't my interview or anything. My first political memory about Georgia politics was freshman year of college, Westminster College, Fulton, Missouri. Going back up to my dorm room and turning on the TV, and here was the senator from Georgia, a guy named Zell Miller, threatening a MSNBC host to a duel, or
wanted
challenging
to go Alexander
him to a
Hamilton
duel.
on him. Yeah.
I was like, who is this guy and where is he from? That was my introduction to Georgia politics back in 2004 at this time. But yes, he was a controversial senator.
Right. Okay. So Mattingly doesn't get in there. Where were we? Okay.
We were 2000,
Okay.
the 2000 Senate, and we were working our way back up to Johnny Isakson, sort of the culmination of his political career, winning that Senate seat, which he still occupies in September 2017.
Right. Free associating. Need to push off a little bit. Okay.
Sure.
Just off your remembrance of Zell and Hardball.
Yes.
Hardball guy with Chris Matthews. Thank you. And this is 2013, I think. 2013, right. Deal had resigned to run for governor.
Okay.
Let me see.
Nathan Deal resigned in 2009 or 10.
Okay, it was probably 9. It was probably 9. Okay, all right. So this would have been, this was the race to replace him.
Okay, and that would be the 9th district?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Doug Collins is the candidate. Brian Miller,
mm-hmm.
Zell's grandson, is the campaign manager. So, and they bring Zell out. And Zell, if you recall, had not been, I mean, since he had spoken at that convention, he was not going anywhere. I mean, he had become a recluse. All his Democratic friends had given him up. Okay, this was his first appearance, right? In a long time, first public appearance in a long time. And so I went up there. It was at Lake Lanier, at the hotel, the resort hotel up there. And I said, "There's Zell." I said, "You know, we sit down. We know each other from way back, and
Sure.
And we start talking about it." And Zell is. We start talking about Chris Matthews, and he says, "I'm sorry I did that. That was the worst thing I'd ever done. And if I could, I would take it back." And we start talking more, and he asks me about Bill Shipp. And he asks how he is, and of course Bill he was doing okay then at that point. And he says, "I really, really am sorry about what I said to Bill. The last thing I said to Bill Shipp was that I hope I live long enough to piss on your grave. And I really want to take that back." So about a month later, I get Bill Shipp in a car, and I drive him up to see Zell. And we have Zell's. Of course, his wife is kind of always has been the ointment that soothes over the rough edges of Zell. I'm blanking on her name. Please help me.
Shirley.
Shirley, thank you very much. There we go. So she sets out lunch for all of us. You know, we get a tour of the house with all Zell's baseball memorabilia.
And this is up at Young Harris.
This is Young Harris, yeah, with Mickey Mantle photos and Roger Maris photos and Ted Williams photos and his I think a photo of him addressing the Democratic convention one year and then the Republican convention another year. And so, they end up saying, "You're a great reporter," and Shipp says, "You're a great governor." They patch things up, and I'm still kicking myself because I never took a photo of it.
Well, there's something to be said for living in the moment.
I'm not sure that I don't think we had smartphones then. At least I didn't.
Well, no, I mean that's a great story, and it gets me to my next question, which is, were politicians and elected officials like Zell Miller the reason Democrats were able to hold on so long?
Oh, of course. They knew how to play the game. They knew. And Zell kind of warned Barnes about changing that flag. He tried to change it.
He had been there.
He had been there, and he almost lost that second race to Zell Miller, to Guy Milner, and it was just awfully close.
Mm-hmm.
Then, so we have. Okay, so I'm out in the burbs at this point.
Right.
Okay. And I'm fine. I'm developing my other skills. And of course, Roy Barnes decides to make his decision about the flag.
Mm-hmm.
And you can have really strong reporters at a state capitol and still not have a writer. You know, it's. I mean, I'm sure academics is the same way. You have people who are incredibly good at research,
Absolutely.
and then people who are much better at conveying the contents of that research. Well, we had the situation where we had some good reporters at the Capitol, but we didn't really have somebody who could pull it all together.
Okay.
So Roy Barnes starts to change that flag, and so they call me back to the Capitol.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
So this would be 2001-ish?
2001. I go back to the Capitol on August 1st, 2001.
So tell me, and I just listened to the replay of the political rewind conversation that you and Bill Nigut had with Governor Barnes. But what was it like covering? Because we got Governor Barnes' side of the story. What was it like covering it and to sort of feel the political tension?
You know, it was really interesting because you felt that everyone involved was so invested in it. Because, you know, if you're you know, there were two issues here. I mean, you know, there was what the battle flag means today, and the history of what happened then.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and everybody, I think I used a line that says everybody was hanging their genealogy out like, you know, like clothes on a clothesline. Because it was you know, everybody was either
to prove your stake.
They either had a daddy who fought in the war, a great granddaddy who fought in the war, or a great granddaddy who was a slave, who was freed by the war.
Right.
And it was incredibly passionate, and I think it's a boat that Republicans missed. I really do. I think Austin Scott caught on. I mean, Austin Scott was part of it. He was part of the movement, but it was at that point where Republicans had a choice to make, and I think they made the wrong one. I mean, it was short term. Okay, probably good for them. Definitely good for them short term. But it was the beginning of this great polarization of the Georgia electorate that we're still dealing with right now.
How would you describe Georgia politics and why it took the Republican Party longer to take root here than it did in states like Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina?
Well, Atlanta for one reason. I mean, Georgia is Alabama, except for Atlanta. I mean, it would be or South Carolina. I mean, it's there is that. I think you also had the Atlanta reputation for biracial cooperation that bled into Georgia politics. And you could see it at work in other communities, like say Augusta or here and there in Athens, the rise of Michael Thurman.
Sure.
And there was a recognition of the balance that had to be struck. You had Zell nominated Thurbert Baker. You know, he needed African American votes to win, and that was one of the prices. There was that huge fight. Was it in the second or third term of Zell's governorship that where we had a kind of a small revolt by the Black Caucus over the lack of black judges in Georgia, and I think that was worked out too. You had Benham. I mean, clear back to Joe Frank. You know, everybody, Democrats understood the need to bend,
right,
and to incorporate, and that if you were relying on the other side needed to get something, needed to have a quid for that pro quo.
So why, apart from the flag issue, which we've mentioned, why were the Republicans able to consolidate control over Georgia politics so quickly? They had been held at bay for so long, but 2002, Sonny Perdue is elected governor. Because of some switching, the Republicans take the state Senate. The next election cycle, the Republicans take the state House. 2010, they win every statewide constitutional office, hold a commanding majority of the congressional delegation, both senators. Relatively rapid consolidation.
A very
of
rapid
power.
consolidation, but I think what you have to kind of look at it in the context of the South as a whole, because Georgia was an island for so many years. It was a Democratic island for. When did Alabama first elect there? Was it Bob James? Was he the first?
I believe so. I believe so. With the endorsement of Vince Dooley. I remember that.
Oh, I don't remember that. Well, that's right, because of the Auburn connection. Sure.
Because he didn't want to endorse here, but he would endorse Bob James.
Oh, okay, all right. That's well. No. Bob James, if I remember right, he had a sporting goods company.
Maybe he did.
I think that might have been a connection as well as the Auburn connection. But I think it was the active balancing act that you saw within the Georgia political. Calvin Smyre.
Sure.
Calvin Smyre became chairman of the Democratic Party in '98, maybe. 96.
He came before Bobby Kahn. Yes, so it would have been probably '96.
Yeah,
because Bobby Kahn and then Jane Kidd.
Right. I mean, think about that. You have a white governor, but you have a black chairman of the party.
Right.
I don't think we've had another one since, have we?
African, no. Bobby Kahn, Jane Kidd, Mike Burlon, DuBose Porter. Mm-hmm. So that's where we're at at present.
Right. And it's so Democrats were doing all these things to keep the tide, to keep the water out of the house. Mm-hmm. But it's one of those situations where once you have a failure, it's a
critical failure.
And I mean, you could see that. You could see what's happening in if you go county by counties. I mean, if you Cobb and Gwinnett, right now what's happening in Henry County right now is, except reverse, it's almost like flipping a switch. Mm-hmm. And one day you're a Democratic oriented party, the next day everybody switched sides. All the whites have gone this way. It's working right now in Henry County, where you have such a big demographic shift.
And maybe not necessarily a generation earlier, maybe half a generation earlier, in Clayton County.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Obviously, with demographics at play. So the South Metro, and you're right, with Henry, Douglas, Paulding is moving that direction more or less. But also Gwinnett, the inner suburbs, Gwinnett and Cobb County are also sort of, if not turning blue, purpling a little bit. And we'll talk about that in a second. Well, actually, let's talk about that now. The Republican Party in Georgia, 15 years of relative political dominance. What is the greatest threat to ongoing Republican control in this state?
Clearly, the demographic
It is
shift.
demographics.
The demographic shift that's happening. I think whites will become a minority in 2025? Is that what the estimate is?
I'm not sure. It may be as soon as that. I for some reason I remember 2040, but maybe that's nationally.
Yeah, I mean, I was speaking to a group of students way out in Covington last week, and after that I had a young African American lady come up, a young student, probably 20 or so, and she tells me that she wants to be a U.S. senator. Of course, you tell her, okay, that's fine, but it's something you have to start working on right now. You're already a year late. But I told her, I told her that the next 2 decades are her decades. I mean, she's arriving at just the right moment, and that's what the Republican Party has to worry about. I mean, you can see it in the fight over Confederate symbolism.
Sure.
It's a reprise of 2001, but notice how the temperature is a lot lower.
Right.
It's not the fervent thing that it was back then, because your rural population is your rural areas are depopulating.
Right.
Your older voters, older regular Republican voters are dying out. And ultimately, I mean, and you've seen Nathan Deal talk about this, that if the state GOP doesn't start reaching out to minority voters, and they haven't been, not in any efficient way, then they are bound from a minority status.
What do you think about the factional divisions within the Republican Party here in Georgia? Some people would argue the governing priorities of the Republican Party post-2003 are not really that dissimilar to the governing priorities of a Joe Frank Harris or a George Busby. How are they the same? How are they different?
So far, I think you're right. So far, I think we've lucked out that way, that you've had. Well, I mean, every Republican governor we've had, and we've only had two, has been a former Democrat, right? And they grow up. They have grown into the business of politics, valuing the same things, which is fiscal stability, and good budget management, and don't get sloppy in either your words or your deeds. That's that part. We haven't had an ideological Republican in that seat yet.
Why do you think that is?
Because Georgia's a big place, and if you think about it, despite the rhetoric, well, for example, okay, let's take Medicaid.
Okay, Medicaid expansion.
No, Medicaid.
Or just Medicaid in general.
Just Medicaid.
Okay.
It's one of the great. I'd have to go back and get on my iPad and call it up. But one of the great statistics that's being passed around there is that you have maybe 17 or 20 counties in South Georgia that, if you put them together, they account for 3 times as much Medicaid spending as happens in all of Gwinnett County.
Wow.
In essence, I mean, so what I'm saying is, despite all the rhetoric about individual independence and not asking the government to take care of you, Georgia still has that Depression era reliance on the federal government to keep people alive.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's number one. I think that's a moderating influence.
Right.
As this debate over the Affordable Care Act tells us.
Right. Huffington Post just had a long form piece on the rural hospital crisis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In fact, they worked with Andy Miller on it. Right. So the economic development angle that every governor of Georgia faces, I think, is a moderating influence. And
I think we saw that with the so-called religious liberty bill.
Oh, that's a perfect.
Is that going to be a flashpoint in 2018?
No, I don't think so.
Really not?
I think because I think they're gonna suppress it as best they can. Mm-hmm. I mean, Brian Kemp will try to make it a factor. Hunter Hill in the governor's race, Josh McCoon in the Secretary of State's race, but you've got that's a $5 billion Amazon headquarters is a huge prize if you can get it. Mm-hmm. And these companies don't tolerate same-sex discrimination.
Or the movie studios.
And that's the big thing. That's actually where it's in 2013, maybe 2014, we had a Chick-fil-A.
Oh yeah.
Was caught
Remember it very well.
Donating money to the California effort to ban put a constitutional ban on same-sex marriage. Okay, the company faced a boycott, a very harsh boycott, and ultimately it made its peace there. Okay, all right. So you fast forward to 2016, the legislature has passed this religious liberty bill. But what's changed? What's changed is you have the movie tax credits that are really ginning up the film industry.
Oh, absolutely.
And who is the beneficiary of it? One of the principal ones is Pinewood Studios out in Fayette County. Who's the principal? Dan Cathy, owner of Chick-fil-A. If Georgia is subject to a boycott because of the same-sex marriage discrimination, Dan Cathy, the Republican, is hurt. It's interesting because it's kind of been the secret of moderation in Atlanta all the way around. I mean, you have that story of Mr. Rich during the height of the civil rights movement saying, I don't care for black or white. The color we're interested is in green.
Right. Athens as well during the desegregation of the university in '61. It was the downtown business establishment that certainly no racial egalitarians of their time, but they were.
But they knew an economic loss when they saw one.
Right, right, and you think that is going forward going to be the driver of Republican priorities, the same as it was the driver of Democratic priorities?
I don't know. And here's the thing. The one thing I will say, I think, and this is speculation because I don't know. We haven't had enough time pass. But I think the one thing that the Trump movement has done within the Republican Party is it has pretty much killed off the social conservative dominance.
Really?
Of that. Yeah. I mean, there's a transactional relationship now between Donald Trump and your evangelists, like Ralph Reed. We can go into him a little bit too,
Sure.
And Jerry Falwell Jr. But in lining themselves up behind Donald Trump, I think they've traded short-term gain for a long-term loss of stature.
Even though the statistics, if I remember them correctly, the exit polls, evangelical Christians, 81% voted for Donald Trump, 16% for Hillary Clinton. That's the widest margin since polling began, and that's including candidates like George W. Bush, John McCain, and Mitt Romney. And obviously, Donald Trump is not. He is not a poster child of adherence to doctrinaire Christian right principles.
No, and
obviously,
I think we're going. I think he is, but I think in the end, I think he loosens the grip on there. I want to see it play out, and they could make a comeback, obviously.
Sure.
But that would be, I mean, since 2004 and the gay rights or the gay marriage ban in Georgia. I mean, you've seen a steady decline in the influence of the evangelical faction of the Republican Party in Georgia, in particularly. And
do you think that was because of differing opinions with the Christian right was sort of an umbrella term for lots of different churches, groups, Georgia Right to Life, Georgia Christian
I think a lot of it
Coalition.
is age-based, quite frankly.
Yeah.
I think it's
generational.
I think it's generational. Because the people who are going to church now aren't the people who were going to church back in the 1980s.
Right. Okay, so the Democratic Party, at the same time, in the political wilderness. The Republicans wandered there in the wilderness for 100 or so plus years. It's been a shorter walk so far, but a pretty lowly one for statewide Democrats or Democrats in general.
And it could go on. And it may be about to get lonelier.
Why haven't Georgia Democrats been able to mount much of an effective comeback at all here in Georgia?
Well, money's one problem. Racial identity is another problem. And I think that's the big one.
The racial, a racial
right,
question.
Right, that you have that we are deep in a trough of identity politics. And as much as Republicans will condemn it in public, they're the beneficiaries right now, as long as most voters are white.
Mm-hmm. So as long as and white voters tend to turn out in higher numbers than non-whites.
You also have, of course, the pairing of the ideological middle, that was kind of the sweet spot for the Democratic Party during all those years. Was, I'm a conservative Democrat, which is kind of like a moderate Republican. Neither exist anymore.
Who are those?
Yeah, and now you have Stacey Abrams, who's a former House Minority Leader, who's running a very identity-driven campaign, focused in large part on African American women, which is a smart thing to do to get the nomination, because those are your most active voters, reliable Democratic voters in the state. Mm-hmm. But when you have that identity, she's going to have, if she gets the nomination, she's going to have a hard time switching to a general election mode. Her
opponent, her former House colleague, Stacey Abrams from Cobb County. What are her prospects? What is her appeal as a candidate?
Well, her appeal is that she's got blue collar roots. Her mom is a waitress at a truck stop, no less, I think. She has this background where she can say that she lived in seven mobile homes when she was growing up.
It was a very, very good political ad.
It was a very good,
very well done.
Yes, it was, and of course she's done real well as an attorney, and even though she's still quite young, so she's got the financial wherewithal to kickstart a campaign like that. So, and she's from Cobb County, which is, of course, she's being mentored by Roy Barnes,
Cobb County native,
and that's where a lot of this impetus is happening.
So Stacey Abrams' strength is the key weakness of the Evans campaign. Is that
right? Yeah, it's
the demographic makeup.
Yeah,
of the primary.
it's interesting. The dynamic is changing clearly. You have let's go back to the Roy Barnes running against Nathan Deal in
2010.
2000.
Yes. Yeah.
12. Oh no, you're right. 2010. And he's running in the primary against Thurbert Baker.
Right.
And Barnes cleans his clock. And now, 8 years later, we have a contest in which an African American woman says, "No, you guys take the back seat this time." And it will be interesting to see how that plays out, and how it registers in November when you have the entire voting electorate out there.
An election that's fast approaching is the race for Atlanta mayor to succeed two-term incumbent Kasim Reed. Give us the quick lay of the land with that race.
Oh, you've got
a lot of moving parts.
You've got about 9 candidates who are they're contenders. You'd have to say. But you have a top tier of Mary Norwood, the council who lost a 2009 race to Kasim Reed
by a few hundred,
by 700 votes or so and change. You have Caesar Mitchell, the council president. You have Peter Amon, the former COO, Chief Operating Officer for City Hall. You have Kathy Woolard, former City Council President, an out lesbian, and the gay vote has become very important in the city.
Right.
You have Kwanzaa Hall, and but I think your top candidates probably are Keisha Lance Bottoms, who's being supported, I think, quietly by Mayor Reed.
And Vincent Fort.
Thank you very much. Okay. All right. So you've got several good candidates chasing the African American vote and several good candidates chasing the white vote. It's almost a 50-50 split in the electorate.
Right.
And so each one
Is it still a north side, south side?
there's that dynamic, but you have Midtown, which is jumping up in population,
Right.
and again influence, especially with the LGBT
Very
community.
cosmopolitan
Right.
part of town.
So they're kind of the deal breakers for each side, and so it's you could get into a 2-person runoff with 12 or 13% of the vote, which is amazing. I mean, I think Norwood will get far more than that because she has the name recognition. But the question is, does she have? She couldn't get to that 50% mark plus 50% plus 1 mark in 2009, when she had pretty much a lock on the gay vote in Atlanta. Now, can she get to that point, even though she doesn't have the gay vote? Because that's going to Kathy Woolard, maybe Peter Rahman. This takes a little bit off of that as well.
Do her? She's not a Republican, a professed independent. Does her close relationship with powerful Republican, big name Republicans, does that help or hinder?
No, it hurts her. It helps her make it into a runoff. It kills her in a general election, because you'll have the state party do what they did 8 years ago, and they will jump into this race and say she's a closet Republican. She's got a lot of very competent Republican staffers on her,
Sure.
but they're identified as Republican staffers, and it's interesting. We may see this the emphasis in past mayoral races has been black-white, but we might be reaching a point where it's actually it's Democrat-Republican may be the better dynamic to judge this by.
Right. So unless you were living under a rock on Mars, we had a high-profile special election here in Atlanta, the 6th Congressional District, to replace Tom Price. John Ossoff faced a field of Republicans and a couple lesser-known Democrats. What are we to make of that, short-term, long-term, of the Ossoff phenomenon?
Long-term, I think it identifies another source of a source of funding for Democrats that I think that they haven't paid enough attention to, and you see Stacey Abrams doing that in the gubernatorial race, relying on national small donors nationwide.
Sort of the Bernie Sanders model.
Right, exactly, and that's what Ossoff played off of. I don't know that it means a whole lot in and of itself, especially given the fact that we're so close to redistricting right now, and that's going to change the map a good bit. It does show me that Trump's appeal is limited, that he's still a handicap for Republicans, especially in a suburban district, and that you can still get nailed for supporting some of his positions. I think Ossoff's in that particular race, Ossoff was at a disadvantage in that there were only a certain number of Democrats that he could turn out, and when he was beyond that, he needed Republican support, right? And he said this right. He said a few things, emphasize economic development, something that would have you might appeal to Republicans. My main criticism about his campaign was that he had to peel off Republican support away from Karen Handel.
Right.
Okay. And Karen Handel has been around the block a few times. I mean, she former Secretary of State. She had a run for governor. She had a run for U.S. Senate. There's a lot of negative material out there on her. And Ossoff simply went with that material that had been used in Republican primaries.
Right, since 2010.
Right, and it was a curious tactic, because basically those were issues that had already been litigated within the Republican framework. You weren't going to get anybody off that. They didn't go after. He didn't go after Trump's attempted repeal of the Affordable Care Act, or the Muslim ban, or the racial animus that he stirred up. None of that was part of his message, and he wasn't demanding anything of Karen Handel in that range. Karen, where do you fit on the Muslim ban? He got her supporting Trump's repeal of Obamacare. Could have hammered her on that, I think.
Do you think, since you mentioned other suburban districts, is Rob Woodall in the 7th district, that Gwinnett-based district?
He's the next bellwether.
Do you think that the 7th is actually probably a more fertile ground for a Democratic candidate than the 6th?
Definitely, and I think they think so too. Now, will you have the money there? I don't know. And you get into this the dynamic, the immigrant dynamic, which is, the numbers are there and the demographics are there, but it takes a generation or so for a new group of ethnic voters to get plugged in and active in the political structure.
Let's get a little meta for a moment on the role of politics and the press. We're living in a different time. President Trump has made eyebrow-raising comments about the media and the press as the enemy of the people and the crooked media. What is the effect on political journalism in general, with that sort of posture, I guess?
To tell you the truth, it might be a lifeline, because leading up to Trump, of course, the newspaper business has been on the decline since '89, and really we started cutting staff seriously, probably about 2005. We had you had an editorial department at the AJC of 500 people, and now I think we're below 200.
Wow.
It's incredibly small, but I think just the concerns over the Russian investigation that's still ongoing right now. We don't know where that's going to go. But the markers there, the story of fake news, in a marketing way, Trump has shown us the value of that comes with having a reliable source of information that you can trust day to day.
Right.
And you see it in the Washington Post new slogan, democracy dies in darkness. Public broadcasting, NPR, stand with the facts. The newspaper, my newspaper, adopted credible as its first word. Credible, compelling, complete. But the emphasis is on credible. So we're slowly making it, or we had started giving away all our information for free. We're slowly putting things behind the paywall. It's actually this last 2 months, they've put me behind a paywall.
And this is politically, Georgia is the new the new access point for AJC's politics. Bill Shipp, who we've mentioned a few times, he said in an interview with Bob Short a long while ago, he says the media manipulates the politicians and the politicians manipulate the media. Was he right?
I think so, probably. We push politicians into corners. And when you do that, you're setting an agenda. If you're trying to, for instance, this week we have a final Senate Republican attempt to repeal Obamacare. Johnny Isakson hasn't spoken on it. It's our job to say, okay, Senator, what are you going to do? So in essence, we're doing that, and yet Isakson, through his access, through just access to him, well, he will manipulate us.
How is the introduction of new media changed political journalism with your perspective as a newspaper?
Well, I know a lot about this because I created the Insider blog.
Right.
And that was Charlie Gay and I started that out. We drew Tom Baxter in, I think 2001 or so. When we shifted to a blog format, I mean, in the early days, the copy took the same path that every other bit of copy took, through the copy desk and all the editing. We shifted to a blog format, of course, and then the same journalist who writes it also edits it, proofs it for accuracy, and punch the button. And I've become my own publisher, which is kind of scary. It's, and Tom became his own publisher, and you kind of wake up to this. I'm typing up a post in my office in the Legislative Office Building, in the Coverdell building on Capitol Hill in Atlanta. So I'm writing about the state Senate. I punch the button on it. I get up off from my desk. I walk across the street to the state Senate chamber, and I've already got a senator in my face saying why I'm wrong. That's new.
Just how reflexive.
It's just how
or I guess just the immediacy.
The immediacy of that, the single individualistic nature of that, which has advantages and huge disadvantages.
Sure.
That was one thing. I think I was the first Twitter account at the AJC.
Very active on Twitter.
And that became the distribution system.
That's the norm. And we should say that's the norm beyond the AJC. Every reporter of note,
Right.
Washington Post, E.J. Dionne's got his Twitter handle, and so on and so
Right.
forth.
It's become a personal publication, a publishing tool. So that is different. And you get to the point where sometimes you're not posting; you're just using Twitter, and you're just sending information out vis-a-vis that.
Which really changes the role.
And it changes the role and changes who you're
journalist.
talking to. You're talking to a specific group of Twitter followers. You're not talking to the general public. So that makes it a little more insidery, if you will, because you start paying more attention to the nuances of politics and not the broader themes that, say, somebody who walks in and reads a newspaper once a day might be seeing.
So we wouldn't put you in the camp that the internet is going to kill newspapers and political journalism. It's going to change.
It's going to change it, and I don't know. And it could be in a very bad way. It could be in a very good way. We don't know.
Right.
We don't know. It's like the arc of history is long, but we don't know whether it bends toward justice.
Right.
It just bends.
Right. So 10, 20 years from now, Georgia politics, what does it look like? If you had to say what the shifts, what the trends, what is Georgia politics, the makeup, the priorities going to look like 10, 20 years down the road?
I think unless you have an arc-changing event, and that's kind of, that's what politics requires. Whether it's World War II, whether it's the Civil Rights Movement,
the critical realigning moments.
Exactly. Without that, I think what you're going to have is a Republican Party in a minority position, and a more flexible Democratic Party that still could be, broken or fail on racial lines. But if the attitudes that millennials right now are showing, if they hold, then you should have a pretty strong Democratic faction, I think.
What do you, and this is relatively current events, but I just remembered it. The reemergence of John Barrow, the Deep South's last white Democratic congressman. Is that, and this sort of, I guess, ties in with the Stacey Abrams model of campaigning with Democrats and the white population of Georgia. Is that the road back for Georgia Democrats, or is it maximizing non-white voter participation?
The question is whether the white moderate voter still exists and still can be had, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, basically, John Barrow is counting on the same pattern that Zell Miller, Roy Barnes, and say Max Cleland,
right,
played. I want to see what Stacey Abrams does,
mm-hmm.
because that will tell us whether John Barrow is the future or just an echo.
As somebody whose time has
right mm-hmm.
passed from view. Well,
but I think it's a good move on his part. I do. The move for
entering the Secretary of State.
Secretary of State. Number one, the Republican opponent is not going to have a whole lot of money.
Right.
And I think the voting issues, especially with Russian hacking, could be such that you want somebody reliable and experienced in that office, and not somebody who's kind of newer on the scene, like a Josh McCoon might be.
Right. Newer, and we should say somebody who has made a name for himself, being more bombastic.
Yeah. Right.
Within that role.
Barrow and I went to school together, by the way. We were in Athens at the same time.
Okay.
Jack Kingston was there too.
Right. The son of Dr. Kingston. And obviously the incumbent Secretary of State is an Athenian, Brian Kemp.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it's just an Athens position.
Yeah.
Maybe we should look into making that happen. Well, anything else we want to touch on? Now is anything you would like to commit to posterity? Any great stories that we missed or that I didn't know to ask about?
Well, there was Ralph Reed.
Let's talk about Dr. Reed, a fellow historian, a fellow history PhD. Different Georgia institution, but I won't hold that against him.
Emory, right?
Emory,
mm-hmm.
That's right.
Okay, all right.
Since we're two UGA guys sitting here.
So he's coming off the Christian Coalition and doing some political consulting.
Mm-hmm.
Decides he's going to be his own candidate. This is 2006. Decides to run for governor. I think with the idea of running, lieutenant governor in 2006, with the idea for running for governor in 2010, and then maybe a 2016 race for the White House. It was. I mean,
a thought out plan.
It was. Look, he is nothing but he's nothing if he's not a guy who gets his ducks in a row. The situation he ran into, though, there's a kind of a saying in politics that you can chase the money or you can chase the office, but you can't chase both. And Mr. Reed had done very, very well financially, and he was just coming into and he's eloquent on the. I mean, he's erudite,
very charismatic,
and he's well spoken. He comes across good in a crowd. He has a small height issue that he fixes with cowboy boots, as do many Georgia politicians. But he's well thought of. The only mistake that he's made is that he's during his non-political years, when he was concentrating on money, he worked very closely with a fellow named Jack Abramoff.
Right.
Kind of the top lobbyist of the Bush years. And Abramoff had gotten into the business of defeating attempts to expand gambling.
Like state lottery? Are we speaking state lotteries?
Well, a state lottery is one way. But casinos on another in other areas. But he was working for other gambling interests, because it's like any industry. You're trying to cut down the competition whenever you can through
Right.
government.
Right.
Okay. And one of the tricks was to call out evangelicals in a state, and get them to oppose gambling, but the effort is being bankrolled by another gaming interest. And let me see, in Alabama, they were trying for a state lottery.
Right.
In Texas, it was a casino. I think in Louisiana, it was a casino. And in each case, Ralph would get out there rallying the evangelical voters, and the money was being filtered from an Indian tribe to Abramoff to the head of not ATF. What is the?
Are we talking about who regulates gaming, or
No.
is this Indian Affairs?
This is a DC-based group. If pause for a minute, I'll look it up. Okay, so we've jogged our memories here.
Right.
Okay, the money would go from the tribe to Abramoff to Gordon Norquist.
Grover
Norquist, Americans for Tax Reform, and then to Ralph and his group. And what happened was that accidentally, Grover Norquist released his tax returns to a reporter for the Boston Globe, which made the Indian tribe link to him. And there was another IRS form that showed the money, that same amount of money, with a little skimmed off the top, going to Ralph. And that became the focus of Ralph Reed's problem in the Republican primary. I got involved in that race. Of course, the Insider blog was really having an effect then. The effect was immediate and such. I also had some contacts that in another interview at another time I might be able to name. I can't name.
Right.
But people who knew people in D.C. who knew people in D.C. who would put me in touch with the proper documents from the investigation that John McCain was doing at the same time. He was doing the investigative. He was heading up the Abramoff investigation for the Senate. And you do have to remember that there was some bad blood between McCain and Ralph Reed. 2000, the South Carolina primary. Ralph was in charge of the campaign for George W. Bush, and in that campaign, McCain was sandbagged with the robocalls that alleged that he was father to a black child, which of course was absolutely true. He and his wife had adopted a tiny baby from Bangladesh out of the goodness of their hearts, which that information was not in there. So you did have some animus there. But the details, of course, came out. Casey Cagle was running a campaign not dissimilar to Ralph's in terms of ideology or and such, and the evangelical vote in Georgia, I think that it hung with him, but not enthusiastically. It was you had Sadie Fields, who was very important in the field then. She was Georgia Christian Coalition. Tim Echols, who would go on to lead Paul Brown's congressional tries and is now a PSC member. Mm-hmm. And I think you had Jody Heiss in there too, who's now a congressman. But there was it kind of struck at the heart of the evangelical movement in Georgia, and as I said, the 2004 vote on gay marriage was kind of the high water mark.
Yeah.
This was kind of the 2006 was the next indication that saying that evangelicals weren't all powerful within the party.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting you're talking about sort of this really deep study, investigative journalism, and yet at the same time we're juxtaposing this with a Twitter feed that is 140 characters long.
Twitter is simply headline writing.
Right.
And every journalist knows how to write a headline. No, your object is to write the headline to get you into the story. And that's what a Twitter message is in journalism. Now, when Donald Trump does it, it's a little bit different. But we know how to write short and compelling. So I don't find it that strange at all.
Well, anything else you want to add?
I'm trying to think here.
Any awkward moments you've ever caught, other than being berated by Paul Begala and finding yourself in the crossfire, which sort of dates me?
Let me see here. Not really. I mean, nothing in the deal stuff. Well, I will tell you what. The one thing. And again, this is where you see Republicans trying to adapt, and I think it needs and I think it needs to be
a
noted.
great addition. Yeah.
Is on the issue of transportation.
I'm glad you brought that up.
There are two changes in Georgia politics that have stunned me in how rapidly they've changed, and one is same-sex attitudes toward same-sex marriage.
Right.
Almost like a light switched, boom. Suddenly it's over 50%, and you've got every reason not to pick that fight again. Okay, then you have transportation, and that's you've had this long animus between Cobb County and Gwinnett County and MARTA.
Yes, very long.
Very long stretches back decades, and suddenly economic development, whether it's NCR's decision to move its headquarters out of Gwinnett and into Midtown, or any half a dozen .coms trying to locate near Georgia Tech, you have seen economic development has really changed the racial attitudes that dominated transportation politics in Georgia. And one fellow you need to give credit for that to is House Speaker David Ralston. He was one of the first big converts. Rusty Paul,
Mayor of Sandy Springs.
Mayor of Sandy Springs, who was another, and Nathan Deal too is working that way, and you see it playing out a little bit in the gubernatorial race right now already, where Casey Cagle is showing a willingness to carry that torch a little bit further. Maybe Brian Kemp is not. Maybe a little bit less so. But to have a transit agency that operates metro-wide. I mean, MARTA is Metropolitan Atlanta Transit Authority, so you'd think that the name would take care of itself, but no, it doesn't.
Not
And we have a Georgia Regional Transportation.
Greta and MARTA.
Yeah, and neither of them actually control regional transportation.
Neither is metropolitan and neither is regional.
So if you want that, and that's what they're going to start working on in the 2018 session of the legislature. And if you get that, you get another facet of governmental involvement that hasn't been around, and requires some infrastructure in terms of what we all agree a government has to do. And I think that may be the most optimistic thing that I've seen come out of Georgia politics since the Republican takeover.
Do you think, I don't remember where I saw the study, but it was basically mapping out all the different cities who've put their bids in for the Google's second headquarters. Atlanta makes it down to about the final 4 or 6, and then gets dinged on.
That was a New York Times kind of breakdown of it, and it gets dinged on transportation.
Is that going to be? Is that enough?
I think what the
catalyst?
object is. I think the object is in January. This is September as we're talking right now. In January, the legislature convenes. I think the object will be to find some fashion legislatively to show Amazon where we're headed, transportation-wise.
Right.
To say we're not there yet. But this is the basis, and we've done this, that, and the other. We've already, they've passed the finally passed the sales tax on to repair roads and bridges after ignoring that for a number of years. MARTA has been given the go-ahead to extend traffic to Emory University, to transit to Emory University. You've still got a North Fulton rail line perking along. And of course, the other aspect of this, of course, is, again, this is where the power of the dollar is beneficial. You have these Republican kind of isolationist counties in Gwinnett and Cobb that are seeing that the money's going elsewhere. The Braves may have been stolen by Cobb from Atlanta, but look what Atlanta is now bringing down to its downtown. And they're being left out of that money, and that's a reason for cooperation.
Well, it was, what, I'll think of it in a second. Emory, annexation, that's the word I was looking for. Do you think where do you think that's headed, annexation?
The court.
the easy and complex issue, yes.
It's been delayed.
Right.
In part because the plan, the original annexation plan, was for the city limits to be extended, but not for the Atlanta school system.
Oh, okay.
That the DeKalb school system would still have sovereignty over that area, which is unusual, has never been tried before,
Right. Yeah. There's no.
and likely to be tested in court.
Sure.
And there are a couple other issues about whether the land is truly contiguous, which is another. So, but that's it's the biggest expansion of Georgia's borders since the 1950s.
Yeah, the 52 annexation
of Buckhead.
What does that, if it goes through, what will be the effect on the makeup of Atlanta politics?
It will. These things always affect the demographics and thus the voting. Yeah, this one will make it. I think in the end, I mean, there aren't many physical people in this area, in this acreage.
Right.
It's a college campus, and so the registered voters there is going to be light. But in the end, other properties will want to attach to the annexed property, and then you're so you're going to get this eastward growth, and most of those are going to be white middle class voters.
Right. Well, Jim Galloway, lead political writer at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Politically Georgia. Thank you very much. It has been a pleasure.
I enjoyed it.
Been a pleasure. Thank you so much for participating in the Russell Library's Two-Party Georgia Oral History Program. Really do appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.